Welcome to Cold Blood Files, the place where we uncover disturbing, chilling, and deeply haunting real-life crime stories. If you're drawn to mysteries, dark truths, and cases that make your spine tingle because they actually happened, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and settle in. Because today, you're about to hear a story that will shake your sense of reality. 3 a.m. A shadow slipped quietly past the checkpoint lights at Camp Balambe. Not an enemy. Not a terrorist. It was an American soldier, once a decorated hero, once someone entrusted with his comrades' lives. But that night, he became the monster people fear in their nightmares. What's the most terrifying part of war? Bombs? Bullets? Or the moment when the one protecting you suddenly turns the gun around and becomes a killer? Imagine you're sleeping peacefully in your small village, believing the war has finally moved far away. But in just seconds, your home turns into hell. Children scream, parents collapse, and fire rises from the bodies of your loved ones. The attacker wasn't a member of the Taliban. He wasn't from any terrorist group. He was Staff Sergeant Robert Bales, a U.S. Army soldier. This wasn't just a murder during war. This was the most horrific civilian massacre committed by an American soldier during the war in Afghanistan, and it became a grim reminder of what happens when the human mind is pushed beyond its breaking point. And if you think you've already heard everything about this case, watch until the very end. Because the truth behind it is even darker than what made headlines. Before the bloodshed. Before the gunshots echoed through the midnight silence. Before the children were burned alive in flames that meant nothing. There was a man. Not a monster. Not a madman. But a husband. A father. A decorated soldier, once trusted to lead, to protect, to serve. A man held up as the very image of what an American warrior should be. His name was Robert Bales. On the surface, he was everything the U.S. military wanted in a soldier. He enlisted after the 9/11 attacks, driven by a desire to serve and defend. He trained hard, took orders without hesitation, and survived not one, not two, but 4 combat deployments, 3 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. He'd made it through roadside bombs, gunfights, and ambushes. To his superiors, he was reliable. To his fellow soldiers, he was a big brother, quiet, disciplined, always leading from the front. But here's what no one noticed. What no one wanted to notice. Behind that calm exterior, something inside him was rotting. Picture this. While the rest of the base slept, Bales stayed awake. Not on duty. Not by choice. But because his mind wouldn't let him rest. The explosions echoed in his ears. The screams. The smell of burning flesh. The image of children torn apart by shrapnel, burned into his brain like a scar that wouldn't fade. And yet every morning, he put on his uniform. Smiled. Acted like a man who had it all under control. A fellow soldier once said, Bales would just sit there, staring into the distance for hours. You'd ask him a question, and he wouldn't even blink. It was like, he wasn't all there anymore. That wasn't a soldier. That was a ticking time bomb, and no one could hear it ticking. Inside Robert Bales' mind was a dark and twisting maze. He had a traumatic brain injury. He suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He had reportedly gone 4 straight days without sleep. He was taking sleeping pills, anti-anxiety meds, and possibly mefloquine, an anti-malaria drug linked to hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme violence. Now throw alcohol and steroids into that mix. Add in a war zone where nothing made sense, where people were dying daily, and where humanity became a blurred concept. Can you imagine what that does to a person? And there's more. Just weeks before the massacre, Bales punched an Afghan truck driver in the face, seemingly out of nowhere. No charges. No disciplinary action. It was brushed off. Laughed at. But this wasn't a harmless outburst. This was a warning shot, one no one took seriously. At home, his wife said he wasn't the same man anymore. He barely spoke. He barely slept. She said, he came home, but it felt like his soul stayed behind on the battlefield. But the military didn't pull him out. They didn't send him home. They didn't say, you need help. Instead, they sent him back, one more tour. As if his mind was just another weapon that could be reloaded. And then, one night, in March 2012, Robert Bales quietly walked out of his base, rifle in hand, leaving behind the lights, the safety, the rules. No patrol. No orders. No team. Just him. And he knew exactly where he was going. No one could have imagined that this so-called war hero would soon become the most infamous mass murderer of the entire Afghanistan war. March 11, 2012. The night air in Afghanistan was cold and eerily silent. A silence so dense, it felt as if the land itself knew something horrific was about to unfold. It was just past 3 a.m. Camp Balambe was quiet. Most of the soldiers were asleep. A few stood watch at checkpoints, eyes half closed, minds on autopilot. None of them noticed the figure slipping out of the base, not in a hurry, not afraid, but with the calm, deliberate pace of someone on a mission only he knew. Robert Bales stepped out of the compound. He carried an M4 rifle, a 9mm pistol, and several magazines of ammunition. He wore his uniform, yes, but his mind was no longer operating under any military code. No map. No radio. No orders. And most chillingly, no military target. His first destination, the village of Al-Kozai, just a few hundred meters from the base. Al-Kozai was an ordinary Afghan village. Mud homes, thatched roofs, dim lanterns still glowing faintly in the night. There were no Taliban fighters here. No gunfire. No combat. Only families, sound asleep, wrapped in dreams, or prayers. Then death arrived, not with a warning, but in silence. Bales kicked open the door of a house, barged in, and opened fire without hesitation. A man holding his wife took the first bullet through the chest. His wife screamed, "Allah," before a second shot silenced her. A child ran from the corner, only to be shot in the back. Blood sprayed across the wall. An infant, still in a cradle, stared up, too young to cry, too young to know fear, before a final shot ended its life. But it didn't stop there. Bales poured gasoline on the bodies, and set them on fire. When villagers arrived later, they found the burned corpses still smoldering, reeking of fuel and scorched flesh. A boy who survived recalled, "I hid behind the curtain. I saw him pour something on my mother's body. Then he lit the match. I didn't dare move. The man who was once a protector of civilians now stood, watching the fire consume the innocent, as if completing some silent ritual, void of remorse, void of reason. After this bloodbath in Al-Kozai, Bales returned to the base. You might think that was it. That perhaps, the horror had ended. That maybe even someone like Bales felt fear, regret, or at the very least, hesitation. But no. He reloaded, changed gear, and went out again. This time, he headed for Najiban, another village nearby. A place where families were still asleep, unaware that death in uniform was marching toward them. Bales used the same pattern: kick in door, fire without mercy, murder everyone, regardless of age, and burn the bodies. One household, 11 people, was wiped out. Women, children, the elderly. No one spared. A toddler, barely 2 years old, clutched a cloth doll as a bullet ripped through her head. Her father, trying to shield her, was shot 3 times in the back. The mother, later found burned alongside her daughter, still wore her nightgown, face frozen in shock. When Bales returned to the base for the last time, blood stained his sleeves and smoke clung to his clothes. He calmly surrendered his weapons and laid down to sleep. Hours later, when he was arrested, he said simply, "I did it. They didn't deserve to live." No tears. No excuses. Just 16 lives lost, 6 others wounded, and one chilling question left echoing in the air. What truly snapped inside that soldier's mind that night? When Robert Bales was arrested, when the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut on his wrists, it wasn't just the detainment of a man. It was the collapse of an image of the loyal American soldier, the decorated hero, the devoted husband and father. Now, he stood accused of being a monster, a mass murderer, a traitor to the very uniform he once wore with pride. But the deeper question is, was Robert Bales truly a monster? Or was he a casualty long before he ever pulled the trigger? In the days that followed the massacre, the world was divided. Some said, there is no justification for what he did. 16 innocent people, including sleeping children, were murdered. This is a war crime, plain and simple. But others, particularly fellow veterans and those who understood the mental toll of combat, asked something different. What if the war killed him first? What if the version of Robert Bales who committed that atrocity was not the same man who first deployed? To understand Bales' descent, we must look beyond the uniform, beyond the headlines, and into the shadowy corridors of a wounded mind. Bales had suffered at least 2 mild traumatic brain injuries during previous deployments. He had served 4 tours, 3 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. With each deployment, he saw more blood, more death, more horror. The kind of horror that doesn't just haunt dreams, it rewires the brain itself. He witnessed comrades blown apart. He made life and death decisions within seconds. He endured an endless cycle of hypervigilance, adrenaline, fear, and grief. And through all of this, he was expected to hold himself together, to come home between tours, hug his kids, mow the lawn, and return as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Bales showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. His wife noticed it. Some colleagues did, too. But no one intervened. The military system, overstretched and understaffed, left soldiers like him to walk wounded, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. To make things worse, Bales was reportedly taking a controversial anti-malarial drug called mefloquine, which some studies had linked to hallucinations, paranoia, and aggressive behavior. That, combined with alcohol, Bales had consumed several shots of whiskey on the night of the massacre, created a mental cocktail as volatile as a battlefield bomb. Imagine the mind of a man whose entire existence has been stretched thin by violence, guilt, trauma, and repeated betrayal, now fed alcohol, disoriented by drugs, left alone with a rifle and no supervision in a war zone. This was not just a breakdown. It was a system failure. And there were warning signs. Bales had previously been involved in a violent altercation at a bar. He had lashed out at home. He'd written disturbing letters to his wife, confessing that he didn't recognize himself anymore. He'd lost money, rank, and hope. He was bitter about not receiving a promotion. He was drowning in debt. And still, he was sent back into combat. The tragedy is that many of these signs weren't hidden. They were there, flashing in plain sight. But the machine of war has no pause button. So Bales kept going. Until he snapped. It is tempting to paint him in black and white, as either a murderer or a victim. But reality is far more complex. Robert Bales was both. He made a choice. He walked off base, twice, and murdered innocent civilians. That cannot be denied or excused. But that act did not happen in a vacuum. It happened after years of psychological deterioration, after moral injury, after witnessing and committing violence on an industrial scale, all while being told to stay strong. If anything, Bales represents something even more terrifying than a rogue killer. He is a mirror. A mirror reflecting what can happen when a human soul is fed only chaos, stripped of care, and trained to survive at all costs. He is not just the product of his own flaws, he is the byproduct of a system that broke him, then threw him back into fire. So what is Robert Bales? A psychopath? A shattered man? A symptom of a deeper illness? Maybe all of the above. And that leads us to a question more disturbing than any battlefield horror. If you lock someone in hell long enough, do they become the devil? Or were we the ones who forged him into it, piece by piece, until he was no longer a soldier, but a weapon pointed in the wrong direction? When Robert Bales was brought back to the U.S., he was no longer the valiant soldier in desert fatigues. He was a man in shackles, head lowered, eyes hollow. On television, he looked like someone already dead inside. But outside, the world was screaming for blood. 16 people. Women. Children. He killed them in their sleep, then burned them like garbage. An Afghan villager shouted during an international broadcast. The entire nation of Afghanistan erupted in outrage. Protests broke out across the country. Extremist groups vowed revenge. President Hamid Karzai demanded that the U.S. conduct a public, transparent trial. Yet the U.S. military rushed Bales out of Afghanistan, quietly, swiftly, almost in secret. Why are they hiding him? Are they afraid of the truth? A local journalist asked. On the first day of the hearing, Robert Bales sat silently, like a stone. His eyes were empty. No tears. No apologies. No resistance. His defense attorney, John Henry Brown, known for representing infamous criminals, stood and spoke. My client is not a monster. He's a soldier crushed by war, by the system, and by the very orders he was forced to follow. The prosecution was not lenient. He was sober. He had a plan. He left, shot people one by one, came back for more ammo, and killed again. This was calculated murder. Tension grew as witnesses took the stand. A fellow soldier testified. "I saw him down a bottle of alcohol at night, then sit staring into nothing, talking to someone who wasn't there." Another added, "Bales once beat up a local civilian for no reason. He wasn't the same guy anymore. He had changed." A psychiatric expert who had examined Bales multiple times took the stand. "I believe he suffers from severe PTSD, possibly with dissociative personality disorder. He was no longer in control of himself." The courtroom went silent. Because if that were true, then Robert Bales wasn't simply a sadistic killer, he was the tragic product of endless war. But people weren't ready to accept that. Admitting it would mean acknowledging that the very military system designed to protect also had the power to destroy a man's soul. Just as the case was about to move into full public trial, something unexpected happened. Bales pleaded guilty. He accepted all charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. No one knew why. His attorney later explained. He didn't want his family to suffer more. He told me, "I've done things that can't be forgiven. I don't want to die, but I have nothing left to say." To some, it felt like justice had been avoided. But others whispered. He was forced to plead guilty. The government doesn't want this dug up any further. If you dig too deep, you'll uncover failings in training, medication, and the policies of war itself. Robert Bales was sentenced to life in prison without parole, held at Leavenworth Military Prison. But somewhere on the other side of the world, the families of 16 victims still waited for answers. For real remorse. For accountability. We don't need an apology. We need answers. "Why did my child die?" said an Afghan father, staring into the camera, tears running down his weathered face. In his cold cell, Bales wrote in his notebook, "Sometimes I can't tell what's real anymore. I still hear footsteps. Smoke. Screaming. Who am I? What have I done? I can't remember what kind of person I used to be before the war began." When the prison door slammed shut behind Robert Bales, it seemed like the story was over. No death sentence. No drawn-out public trial. No fiery debates on television. Just an American soldier, once celebrated as a hero, now condemned to a fate worse than death, to be forgotten. But was that really the end? For many Americans, the Robert Bales case became a stain quietly swept under the rug. The media talked about it for a few weeks, then moved on. The military turned its focus to new operations, as if Bales were just a bad apple, a rare aberration, not a symptom of something larger. But in Afghanistan, the memory of that night never faded. In the villages of Al-Khozai and Najiban, the bloodiest scenes of the massacre, survivors still walk on the very soil where their loved ones were gunned down and burned. Every night, when the wind howls through the mountains, elders tell children the story of the ghost soldier who appeared in the dead of night, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like the blade of death. A grieving mother sobbed. "My daughter was only 6. She was asleep when the bullet tore through her head. I can't forgive, not because I hate, but because I don't understand. Why? They say Bales killed 16 people. But the number of lives destroyed goes far beyond that. His wife, Carolyn, was thrown into a storm of media frenzy. Branded the wife of a murderer, she faced harassment at her children's school, threats from former neighbors, and the cold silence of friends who once praised her husband as a hero. In an interview, she said, "I don't know who he is anymore. The man who came back from his 4th deployment, he wasn't the man I married. Their 2 children, one in preschool, the other just learning to speak, grew up asking, 'Where's Daddy?'" The Robert Bales massacre was not just an individual tragedy, it was a damning reflection of a broken system. A system that trains soldiers like machines, then acts shocked when they lose their humanity. A system that hands out antipsychotic pills but fails to monitor side effects. A system that rewards toughing it out instead of offering real mental health support. A society that cheers for war, but refuses to look at the shattered minds and bodies it leaves behind. And in the end, when one soldier breaks, not on the battlefield, but among sleeping civilians, everyone scrambles to frame it as an isolated incident, tearing him from the context that created him. Robert Bales is serving a life sentence without parole. But is that enough? The Afghan villagers received small monetary settlements, but no formal apology. No recognition of truth. No global hearing for their grief. To them, we were just numbers. Nameless bodies. But to us, they were our whole world. Said a young survivor during a memorial service 5 years later. If tomorrow, another soldier snaps, fires into a crowd, and kills 16 more, will we really be surprised? Or will we simply sigh? Here comes another Robert Bales. Because if we refuse to confront the truth, if we don't listen to the pain on both sides, the broken soldier and the innocent victim, then war never really ends. It just changes faces. Robert Bales is no longer a soldier on the battlefield. He's now just a name in a file, a murderer in the eyes of the public, a cautionary tale in psychological warfare seminars. But if we only view this story through the narrow lens of one man's crime, we may be missing something much greater. Bales' actions are unforgivable. Children were shot in their sleep. Mothers lost the very heartbeat of their lives. The night echoed with screams that will never fade. That pain is irreversible. And yet, Bales was also a product of a brutal war machine. A system that forged men into weapons, stuffed their pain into silence, and covered up psychological scars with slogans like mental toughness. We, those of us still watching behind screens, must ask ourselves, how many more soldiers will quietly fall apart? How many more families will be shattered by a war they never signed up for? And how many more times will we wait until tragedy strikes before we ask why it happened? Perhaps we can't change the past. We can't bring the dead back. But we can choose to face the truth, we can listen to pain, and we can stop turning away from what makes us uncomfortable. The story of Robert Bales isn't just about a massacre. It's a wake-up call about war, mental health, survivor silence, and the real cost of violence, paid not in headlines, but in human lives. If you've stayed until now, I thank you, not just for your time, but for your presence, your empathy, and your open heart willing to sit with this story from beginning to end. If this story moved you, share it, because the world forgets what it doesn't talk about. Leave a comment below. Are you angry? Shocked? Reflecting on something deeper? Let's talk about it. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and join me on this journey into the shadows, where the truth isn't always easy, but always worth facing. Because the truth doesn't always comfort, but it always matters.